Welcome to TOAMagic.com's Auction of the People pre-stream. We're breaking down the 8 decks that will be featured in this exclusive event for the top 8 players in our EE6 leaderboard. These are all decks that have won a Grand Prix in the Legacy format in the past 12 years. That said, let's get to some decks.
And here we have Death and Taxes, piloted by Thomas Innevolton to a victory in Grand Prix Strasbourg. He played the same 75 as his teammate Michael Bond, who lost in the semifinals, and he defeated a Rug Delver strategy in the finals. So what is the primary game plan of the Death and Taxes strategy?
Death and Taxes is a mana denial deck, first and foremost, with cards like Wasteland and Rashad and Port Tayam as bonus resources. That's the taxes. And then it will have an Ether Vial, which will allow it to put powerful 2 mana and 3 mana creatures like Stoneforge Mystic or Flicker Wisp onto the battlefield and attack them, which is the death part.
Sure. Yeah, it's just a lot of creatures, 4 Aether Vials, some equipments, and 4 Swords of Plowshares as removal. Looks pretty similar to the Goblins deck, plus with the extra main deck removal spells, but still an Aether Vial deck at the core. And this was right after the release of Gatecrash, so Deathrite Shaman is at full force in the format at this point, but this deck does not particularly care about the 1-mana Planeswalker, as it were. So any interesting main deck metagame choices that you're seeing in this list?
There's a lot of cards that are going to be a little bit different than a current build. The release of Conspiracy 2 kept this archetype intact, but shifted a lot of the cards dramatically in value with things like Recruiter of the Guard and Sanctum Prelate, giving the deck a better game against the unfair decks like Storm, and Recruiter giving it a different angle to shoot against the fair decks, where you chain Recruiter and Flicker Wisp together. The deck does have Stoneforge plus Barraskull and Jite, whereas sometimes we're seeing a little bit more equipment from some of the decks, sometimes a little bit less. But Umezawa's Jite and Barraskull are both going to be pretty good in this format.
And how difficult would you consider Death and Taxes to be from the pilot's perspective?
Death and Taxes is one of those 80-20 decks where 80% of your plays are going to be really simple, intuitive. I'm going to go ahead and port them on turn 2 because I played a Vial on 1. Getting the maximum value with a deck like this is very difficult because none of your cards are inherently busted, inherently powerful. You can't just open up on Dark Ritual ad nauseum, I'm going to kill you. Instead, you have to finesse the game and get ahead or disrupt your opponent on a critical turn, knowing that you should be tapping them off their 4th land so they can't cast Jace against you is fairly critical.
Sure, it seems like some of the decks in this format are just putting a massive creature in play as early as turn 1 or turn 2, or searching up their equipments from the other Stoneforge Mystic decks, and this deck is really just trying to cobble together a win with 2 mana 2/1s and 3 mana 3/1s. So it's a bit of an ask, but I think with the right piloting, this deck can be very, very powerful. And how would you consider the sideboard in this list?
The sideboard's kind of a mixed bag, a lot of different tools. You have things like Relic of Progenitus and Rest in Peace for the unfair decks that kind of abuse the graveyard with Reanimator and Flashlock both being in the format. You definitely have the tools to take on everyone. This is a deck where if you had to design a deck like this to take on this whole field, I don't think you would see that many different choices. Overall, you might see something like Wiltleaf Leech not seeing play because there's no Liliana of the Veil decks in this format, but you're not going to be seeing huge differences throughout this deck. I think this is a balanced deck. It's a fair deck. It's going to keep everyone else in check.
Sure. And finally, how do you foresee the bidding of life and cards going with regards to Death and Taxes?
Again, this kind of comes down to how much experience someone has with a deck like Death and Taxes. The higher end lines are very tough to identify and figure out, but if you just play this deck all the time already, you're going to want it a lot more. I think Death and Taxes can go in the like 6 cards, 11, 12 life sort of range.
That seems reasonable. Yeah, minus a few cosmetic changes and a couple new additions. This deck is pretty much the same as it is currently. I'm sure we'll be seeing it running deep in the EE6 main event.
Yeah, this is the list from 6 months ago.
Yeah. So minus the conspiracy cards, you just have the Mangaro's Mind Sensors main deck instead. And same planes Aether Vial your turn.
Yep.
There we have it with Death and Taxes.